Every criminal act that involves obtaining money illegally produces funds that need to be laundered. The IMF estimates that 2.5% of global GDP is laundered every year. With me now is Dennis Cox, author of the Handbook of Anti-Money Laundering. Dennis, money laundering, where are the trouble spots?
As crime goes up around the world, then clearly people want to try to turn those funds into money they can use. That means that everywhere is a trouble spot. The main centres of financial crime deterrence become the UK, America, because we're the centre of the financial markets. So we have to be particularly vigilant in the major markets to try to look out for these kind of funds.
Well, you wrote money laundering is one of the few global growth industries that seem to be prospering at present. How is this industry structured and what is the process?
Every time you have something stolen from you or you have someone trying to extract money from you in some way, they're going to try to place it into a source so they can actually get true value from it. As crime goes up, and we're discussing things like terrorist financing in the book, but obviously drug trafficking, human trafficking and other types of crime, they're all growth industries, I would regret. And of course if they're growth industries, then by consequence, money laundering itself becomes a growth industry. Very much organised crime, a lot of organised crime involved in this kind of process. Or there's a difference between what I would call amateur money laundering, which is when the single person who's just stolen from a flat trying to sell a TV or something, as opposed to professional money laundering, which is more attached to the organised criminals who are doing drug trafficking, human trafficking, terrorist financing and those kind of matters.
So how profitable an industry would you say it is for those who are doing the dirty washing?
The person who's trying to get the proceeds so they can use them legitimately is willing to take a discount on the funds, which is sometimes quite substantial. They know that they want clean funds that they can use and they're willing to pay for that privilege. That means that there's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of funds that can then be moved around in those ways. And that creates the advantage, that creates the preference, and that means that we actually have new things coming through all the time. Money laundering tends to stay ahead of the regulations. The challenge with anything in this space is trying to stay ahead of the money launderers.
How are governments cracking down, and is there any traps legitimate businesses can fall into unwittingly?
Increasingly there's new sets of rules coming in terms of the way you have to verify your staff, including people like contractors, to see that they are legitimate, and that's particularly focusing on the financial services industry. One of the key areas has been within the taxation market, and they're thinking about taxation. If you underpay tax, then clearly that is ill-gotten gains from the evasion of taxation, and where this line comes between avoidance and evasion is clearly a very difficult line to tread.
How do international standards differ and what challenges do these pose?
We do have some global standards, primarily promulgated by the Financial Actions Task Force, so there are other principles around like the Weisberg principles, and we have the European directives. But everyone seems to want to have their own derogation, and of course you have to then align it to the laws of the country. And so you walk into things on data privacy, for example, which can make life quite difficult sometimes. What am I allowed to connect? What data am I allowed to hold? And once you start to have restrictions on the data, then it makes it much harder to identify and really identify either the corporate or the person.
Well, considering that illegal activity is now counted towards GDP, surely cracking down is actually going to hit economies.
Does money laundering create employment? I'm not convinced it does. Does it add value to society? I'm not convinced it does that either. So the elimination of it in terms of improving an economy, making it feel like a good place for people to do business, where you can do business safely, I think that creates greater growth than anything we could possibly lose by some loss of numbers on a fictitious GDP figure.
Well, there is a general understanding that the authorities are more interested in large amounts of money. So when it comes to small amounts of money, do these slip through the net?
I think they do, and this is what we call something like the plumber. I mean, is it plausible that your plumber might take cash? Then is it plausible that your plumber may then not disclose all of that cash to the tax authorities? And is that exciting in terms of finding organised crime? Well, the answer is no, it's not. So clearly at that end, it's to an extent allowable. Now we in the UK have set up the rules with a zero de minimis. That's because child pornography and child exploitation are seen as being areas where quite small payments may turn up.
So how easy is it to prosecute and how many people get away with it in reality?
The number of prosecutions is not high enough, and I think everyone would agree with that. There's a lot of work done in terms of producing suspicious activity reports and sending them to the relevant authorities in all the middle countries. But in many countries there are almost no prosecutions. Here we're slightly better within the UK market. The US is doing slightly better too, but some other countries you find hardly any prosecutions at all. It doesn't mean there isn't money laundering, it just means it's not prosecuted.